The light that we now kindle inspire us to use our powers to heal and not to harm, to help and not to hinder, to bless and not to curse, to give and to receive, always with gratitude. Blessed be. All of you are very much appreciated. It's just a nice experience for myself, I think for Lynn, my wife, to be back here. It's just a good time of year to reflect on all sorts of things and opportunities that we have to be supportive of this congregation, supportive of this community, and just to be helpful to each other. And that includes all of you who are down here, including the choir, of course. And you folks up in the balcony, you have not been forgotten. So welcome all of you, whether you're first time or whatever it might be. Now, some of you are going to go home, and members of the family, neighbors perhaps, co-workers, who knows, they're going to ask you, well, what did the minister talk about today? You know, you went to church this morning. What did that guy lecture about? And you can say, if you like, just to summarize, well, he talked about marigolds. So we have a marigold over there, if you're curious. He talked about monarch butterflies, Halloween, Day of the Dead. And then he tried to define and explain evil. But he really wasn't very good at that. He didn't really do a very good job. But he relied on 3 authors, and they all had something to say about the topic of evil. And then the minister, wound up by saying, well, is there an unforgivable sin? Is there an unpardonable crime? And so he had some comments on that topic, and then we went to the coffee hour, and we all went home. Okay. Let me explain. Okay. This is a very important time of year. It's what we call a time of liminality. Liminality, I'm going to try to explain that a little bit more in just a few seconds. But basically, when we talk about liminality, we talk about the threshold in our lives. So we can talk about our personal lives. We can also talk about the life of the community, the congregation, even the nation. Liminality, it's a time of transition. So we're going from this phase over here, we can call that the past, the present moment, the threshold, if you like. And then we're transitioning into something that's new. And we're not sure what it is. So in these liminal moments, there can be confusion, ambiguity, uncertainty. And the process of transition can be difficult. Not always, but it's frequently difficult. We're not really sure just where we're going in our individual lives, in the life of the nation as a whole. Now, in personal lives, we sometimes talk about rites of passage, where we know that something is changing. Birthdays, they're sort of a rite of passage when you think about it. We realize we're a year older. We hope a year wiser. We're not always sure where we're headed, but we hope that we're moving in the right direction. So that's one rite of passage, if you will. And there are many others, including national holidays, where we pause and think, you know, where are we going as a country? You know, what's happening in this situation? What does it mean? Indeed, if it has any meaning at all. Now, in the Northern Hemisphere, we know that we're in a time of transition. Some people refer to this season, late October or November, as being one of the thin times, T-H-I-N. Is the microphone working okay? All right. I can speak louder if you like. How's that? Okay. A time of liminality. Now, in the Northern Hemisphere, we're moving from a time of light and warmth to a time, well, things are going to get colder, a little more difficult. Even here in Florida, we're going to have some cold nights ahead. And so it is in the harvest season. We make our plans for how we can be helpful with food assistance, energy assistance, microphone assistance? Okay, I'm not sure. Okay, I hope for the best. In Mexico, this is the time when the Day of the Dead is celebrated in many communities. Now, according to some legends, the marigold flower has special importance because the goddess of the dead comes back, and she uses the marigold because it's a colorful flower that can guide people who are deceased back to the homes, back to their families. It's a colorful flower, but also it has a strong smell. I think all of you know that. I once asked a florist if he ever sold any marigold bouquets. I was serious. I was curious. And he said nobody would buy a marigold display. They smell too bad. Maybe you agree. Maybe you disagree. But that's one of the reasons why marigolds are so important in this season. Something else that's very important in Mexico and perhaps here in the United States, the butterflies, and in particular the monarch butterfly. And maybe you can see this, but I'll put it on display. You can come and look at it. As you know, the migrant butterflies, they travel 3,000 miles on the return from the Sierra Madre Mountains all the way up, well, some go to Florida, others go all the way up into Canada. And this represents, for many Mexican people anyway, at least according to tradition, the souls of the dead coming back in a cycle that continues over and over again, where they're reborn, they live, they make their migration, they die, and then another generation rises up. In a sense, the butterflies are reborn, and the process continues. And this slogan reminds us there are no borders, no clear division between Mexico, the United States and Canada. And we're reminded that this migration has gone on, well, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. We don't really know. Started long before our time. And this migration, this cycle of birth, life, migration, movement, death, and then rebirth, it happens again, over and over. And that's part of what is celebrated during the Day of the Dead ceremonies, why they've become so important to so many people in different places. Some of you may call this paganism, paganism. Seems kind of ominous. When Unitarian Universalists talk about paganism, frequently what we're talking about are Celtic traditions. That's our variety of pagan. The Celts, of course, are those Aboriginal people in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Brittany, some of the other places over in Europe. And of course, immigrants, particularly from Scotland and Ireland, have come over to North America and brought some of their traditions along with them. And there's a variety of Celtic holidays, and our CUPS group here in the Tampa congregation is familiar with all of them. There's actually 8 days, but there are 2 in particular of importance: Beltane and Samhain. Beltane is what is frequently called May Day, 1st of May, and that's a time of transition. Well, we know that we're moving towards the summer solstice, so we've seen the last of the cold weather up north, and we're moving towards happier times where we can be outdoors more often and celebrate the light. We're very much aware of that. So there's a lot of dancing and feasting and that kind of thing for May Day. 6 months later, more or less, there's another transition, and that's the period that we're into right now, which we call, well, you would call it Halloween, perhaps, but which means All Hallows Eve. But traditionally, it would be called Samhain, Samhain. And it's the awareness that things are going to become a little more difficult now. And as I've already explained, It's part of the harvest season and a time when we make our preparation for the coming of winter. And even in Florida, we know that things will be more difficult. We worry especially about homeless people and others who are going to need our assistance. We can think of this as a cycle of the seasons. Things go round and round throughout all of eternity, like a carousel. But we hope that in the midst of all of this, there are opportunities to grow wiser, to appreciate these transitions, and to appreciate our opportunities to live in the right sort of way. So in the midst of the eternal cycle, we speak for a genuine spiritual transformation, and it can happen. I struggle with this concept of liminality. How can I best explain it? And there's one Unitarian writer who I think you're all familiar with, who I think is the master of explaining transition. Let me read one of his works, and I think some of you will recognize this. He explains, there is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. Is that the sound of a bongo drum back there? Okay. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It's the area which we call, what do we call it? The Twilight Zone. Okay. I think many of you can recognize these words. They're from Rod Serling. And he varied the words over a period of 5 years, which is when the original Twilight Zone series was televised, 1959 to 1964. And the words did vary somewhat depending on the episode, but this is a pretty good accounting. Rod Serling was indeed a Unitarian who became a Unitarian Universalist because of the merger in 1961. Now, he wasn't Scottish, he wasn't Irish. He was actually born into a Reformed Jewish family in Syracuse, New York, 1924. But he grew up in Binghamton. So he said that Binghamton was his hometown. He liked to go back there every now and then. For Rod Serling, and this was true for many people in his generation, the great moment of transition, of liminality, the threshold, really for the entire generation, was World War II. Now, as a boy in high school, or a young man, I suppose, he wanted to go to Germany to fight against the Nazis. The day after he graduated from high school, he went out and he enlisted in the Army. And that was his Twilight Zone experience. He often talked about it in later life. He expected to go to Europe. He went into the 11th Airborne Division, and he got sent instead to the Pacific. And for Rod Serling, it was pure hell. The 11th Airborne really wasn't, it was a parachute division, but it really wasn't involved in many airborne operations. They just didn't happen in the Pacific theater of war. They were used as elite troops, as shock troops, and they were placed in very difficult, horrible, often tragic situations in the Philippines and in other places, and it was a nightmare. It was a nightmare. Serling was wounded repeatedly. He was hospitalized, brought back to the front lines, wounded again, hospitalized, brought back to the front lines. And he tells about some of his experiences in his memoirs. He tells about an experience where he was with a close friend, And they had put together a comedy routine in the field to try to entertain the troops. And in the midst of it, a friend's head was blown off by military action. And you can imagine, maybe you can't, but try to imagine what this sort of thing was like, and not just for Rod Serling, but for people throughout the world during World War II. The second transition in his life, which he says was a major transition, he came home, took advantage of the GI Bill, went to college. He went to Antioch in Ohio, which is a traditional Unitarian, now a Unitarian Universalist school, and he converted to Unitarianism because he said it made sense to him. And he stayed with the Unitarians, the Unitarian Universalists, for the rest of his life. He moved to California, of course, became a very popular writer in Hollywood, joined the Santa Monica UU congregation, was very active in the congregation, was very active in community work with the ACLU, NAACP, and then in the 1960s he became very active in the anti-war movement, and the Santa Monica congregation as a whole still has a reputation for being very active in social justice work. The late 1960s, or rather the late 1950s into the 60s, were of course the years for the Twilight Zone. Rod Serling wrote most of the episodes, and some of them had to do with wartime experiences directly. You may remember some episodes that were actually trying to portray wartime conditions. Many of the episodes came back to themes that still haunted him in dreams, flashbacks. He tried to confront the problems of suffering, quite frequently the problems of evil, which appears in different ways in the world. And this is what he struggled with. There have been many attempts to revive the Twilight Zone since the 1960s. There have been movies. Rod Serling, and I didn't know this until the other day, actually wrote the script for the first Planet of the Apes movie. Now that's a bit of a strange story. But like many of the episodes of the Twilight Zone, what we discover is that things are not always what they seem. We expect that life is going to be like this, but it turns out to be quite different. Quite often, evil has to be confronted, and in most episodes, but not all, evil can be overcome. Planet of the Apes, I'm not really sure, those of you who remember the story, what has happened. But you can watch that on late night TV or whatever you like. Try streaming. The Unitarian author of the 1800s who really tries to struggle with the problem of evil is Nathaniel Hawthorne, who of course is one of the Transcendentalists. So he's in Concord during the 1830s, 40s, 50s. This is a time of great optimism for most of the Unitarians and for the Universalists as well. So much gets said about what used to be called Emersonian optimism. You know, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's sort of the dean of the Transcendentalists, is convinced that things are getting better and better in the United States. We can do anything. We're moving always in the right direction. Think about all the technological marvels of the 1800s. Think about political, social progress. Clearly, says Emerson in many of his essays and sermons, clearly we're moving in the right direction. And there are many Unitarians and many Universalists who agreed with Emersonian optimism. But somewhere on the sidelines is Nathaniel Hawthorne, and he's not convinced. There's a lot to celebrate, says Hawthorne. There's a lot to enjoy in the world. He has a very happy marriage and a good family. Most of his life is in comfortable situations. And yet it's Hawthorne who understands the tragic element of American life. And he's haunted by something that he wants you to know about. Hawthorne comes from an old Puritan family in Salem. They came to America in the 1600s, and they were present for the first of the Indian Wars, and they destroyed Indian villages, his first ancestor in what is now Massachusetts. John Hawthorne, actually the name was pronounced Hathorne. John Hathorne is one of the judges at the Salem witch trials in 1692. And later on, after the trials are over, there are other judges who come forward and they apologize. And they say what happened was wrong. It was a tragedy. Should never have happened. But Judge Hawthorne never asks for forgiveness because he's convinced that there were witches and that what he did was right. And his descendant, Nathaniel Hawthorne, is haunted by these family events, this family history. And he looks around in the United States and he can see the cruelty and the failures. He can see the racism. He can see the slavery, the injustice to American Indians, corporate greed, deceit, betrayal. Hawthorne is the transcendentalist who reminds us that these things are with us still. And he asks us to face this reality. Things are not as they seem, says Hawthorne, and we're reminded of that in many of his stories. Now, some of you may remember The Scarlet Letter from high school. Maybe you read that. And that's a story in which we don't really know what's happening. There's just too many secrets, too much duplicity, too many betrayals, too many people who aren't what they really say they are. So we can think about Hester Prynne. She's been put on trial. But is she really the guilty party? You can think about the minister. Well, he has secrets to conceal. Hester Prynne's husband reappears, her real husband. She is married after all. But he doesn't confess that he's the husband. He engages in his own acts of wickedness. And there are other characters in Scarlet Letter who just aren't what they seem to be. And this theme of Hawthorne's continues. Young Goodman Brown is a story about the young Puritan in Salem who goes into the forest to try to discover who and what he really is. And he's horrified. He meets his neighbors, people who he's admired all his life since boyhood, people who he respects. And they're not what they seem to be, even members of his own family. And we're told that when he faces this reality for the rest of his life, he lives a life of gloom and he leaves no epitaph behind. And this is Hawthorne. And there are many other stories, including some that are actually comic, if you can believe that. Feathertop is a wonderful story about old Mother Rigby the witch who creates a scarecrow for her garden. She calls the scarecrow Feathertop. But he's so attractive and she's so delighted by her creation that she gives Feathertop the power of life, where he can actually move around and talk and go into the larger world. And he's very successful in engaging with others, becomes very popular with the governor's family. All kinds of prestigious people admire Feathertop. And then one day he looks into the mirror and all he sees is a scarecrow. He's horrified. He's looked into the mirror and he sees himself as he really is, and he can't accept it. He runs back to his creator and he just collapses And she forgives him. She forgives herself. She says he wasn't ready. He couldn't handle this experience of finding out who he really was. He wasn't a great man. He was just a scarecrow pretending to be a great man. There are other Hawthorne stories that are worth mentioning that have this tragic element. Sometimes they're comic, but usually not. Ethan Brand is a story about a man who suddenly appears at Mount Greylock, which is a mountain in the Berkshires, western Massachusetts. Everybody thinks he's a lunatic. He says he left Greylock years ago. He left the Berkshires to search for the unforgivable sin, the unpardonable crime. And he found it. And he can't live with the understanding because he's betrayed too many people. And he dies. And that's essentially the story of Ethan Brand. Hawthorne said it was going to be the first in a trilogy. There would be 3 stories about Ethan Brand and what he discovered in the world. But for some reason, only the first installment. And so it was some months ago that after having read Ethan Brand once again, I thought I would go into the world in search of the unforgivable sin, the unpardonable crime. And I did as much research as I could. And I talked with different people. And let me give you the opinion. I really can't explain what evil is. But, and I don't know if any religion can, but all the great religions seem to agree on one point. All of us have the opportunity to find something good in life, to live a better life. All the great religions agree that free will is with us. We can move in the right direction or the wrong direction. It's not always easy, but it's possible. There are better ways of living. And it's really up to make the choice, up to us to make the choice. Now that's very optimistic, perhaps. But evil arrives in what, and for want of a better word, I'm going to call nihilism. Nihilism, I suggest, and it appears in many forms, is the belief that, well, choice isn't really possible, doesn't really matter. Good and evil, they're really just subjective conditions. There's nothing that's definitely evil, there's nothing that's definitely good. It's all rather pointless. And ultimately, says the nihilist, the only thing that really matters is power. That's it. Brute force, cunning, deceit, strength, the ability to dominate others. Sounds like fascism. Although there are certainly other forms of brutality that can be mentioned, other forms of authoritarianism. Nihilism, I think at its worst, is the denial that good is even possible, that it could possibly exist. And it embraces, well, it embraces the opposite of good. And that, perhaps, you would call evil, although you may choose other words. The author who had to confront this, one of many, but I think who was particularly effective in confronting the problem, was Hannah Arendt. How many of you know Hannah Arendt? Okay. Great political scholar, theorist, philosopher, writer of the 20th century. Arendt is born into a secular Jewish family in Germany, late 1800s. She's very proud that she's a German, very proud of Germanic culture. She thinks Germany's moving in the right direction. There is no nation superior, no nation more liberal, more sophisticated than Germany at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. And then, of course, as you all know, after World War I, and we're moving into the 20s and 1930s, the illusion is gone, the bubble breaks. Germany embraces nihilism, that power raw power is all that really matters. The ability to dominate and to extinguish others. And this is the problem that Hannah Arendt and everybody else in Germany has to confront. And some do, and some don't. She's very fortunate and she can escape to the United States, and she does. But many family members die in the Holocaust, perhaps not fully understanding what has happened and what has gone wrong. She says in 1945, the problem of evil will be the great problem that philosophers will have to confront for the rest of the 20th century. And I don't know whether they do or they don't. In 1961, she goes to Jerusalem for Adolf Eichmann's trial, and of course he's one of the Nazi war criminals who's been caught and brought to justice. She expects to see a monster, some kind of demon, in the courtroom. She doesn't see a monster or a demon. What she sees is a rather ordinary, even pathetic human being who fails to see what he has done, refuses to accept responsibility, blames others, says, I was under orders, I had no choice. No particular sympathy, and certainly no empathy for the people who have suffered. And when she confronts that reality, when she sees what Eichmann really is, well, she talks about the banality of evil, the ordinariness of evil, how any of us can fall into this kind of behavior. And she finds that experience horrifying. Hawthorne had dealt with that same theme in Young Goodman Brown. He goes into the forest. He meets the devil himself, and the devil turns out to be Young Goodman Brown, or at least someone very similar to Young Goodman Brown, perhaps an older version. And that is beyond all tragedy. Can we accept our ability to be like an Eichmann or to accept this kind of behavior? Hannah Arendt asked that question, and I don't think she was ever really satisfied that she had a response. How do we get free from this situation? I think that the best we can do is to try to proceed with compassion, with a desire to do good as best we can in the world, to try to be helpful where we can. Maybe not to define evil or even to define good, but just to proceed with some sense of responsibility. Hannah Arendt said, the big question is always, can I face myself in the mirror? Can I accept myself and what I've done? And that's still the big question. Unitarian Universalists can ask that question. And I think this is the time of transition in this country, when that question needs to be asked repeatedly. Blessed be. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Murphy. That was food for thought. Good morning. I'm Evelyn Cape. Hey, Sue. Sue's here. I'm Evelyn Cape. I've been a member of UUCT for 8 years, if you can believe it. It seems like yesterday. Thanks. And I'm the advertisement for paying your pledge, so try to keep it short and sweet. Why am I a UU? For having a structure to adhere to week after week, to have a framework of gatherings and discussions and patterns and organization, to know what to expect generally, yet what to enjoy frequently, as our innovative members are always coming up with original ideas, as we saw with the choir and the minister today, didn't we? I'm a UU for the structure. Why am I a UU? To contribute my own ideas to our church, ourselves, and each other. To use my brain to explore my own thoughts and try to understand how these thoughts weave in and out of the beliefs of others in the congregation. To understand how thoughts evolve to spirituality. To continue to evolve through the years in my opinions as I grow in my mind. I'm in UU for my brain. Why am I a UU? To work through emotions that come with being a person of heart, with changes from joy to sorrow, to empathy, to pain, to gratitude. To develop my own spiritual understanding over time. To learn to understand how our structure contributes to our ideas that evolve into dealing with our emotions. I'm a UU for my emotions. Why am I a UU? To participate in the many groups in our church, from the choir and music, to hospitality, to the Pledge to End Racism, to Magnolia's small group ministry, to Sisters Rowing North Book Club, to greeting and ushering, and on and on. To make wonderful, wonderful, wonderful friends to help me deal with ideas and emotions. I'm in UU for the groups and the friends. Why am I a UU? To improve my life and try to improve the lives of others at our church and beyond, as we all evolve through our lifespans to the time beyond, dealing with ideas and emotions to be comforted infinitely. I'm in UU for the comfort. Blessed be. Thank you.
Place, if you have found freedom, take it with you into the world. In this place, if you have found comfort, go and share it with others. In this place, if you have dreamed dreams, help one another that the dreams may come true. And if you have known love in this place, give some back to a bruised and hurting world. Go in peace, go in love, and may we become good ancestors for future generations. Amen.